Sorry, I don't love you. A phrase I've grown accustomed to. Cause with you something isn't wrong, something isn't wrong, something isn't right. I wish you could be happy.
Hey everyone, welcome to Geekdom is back, as is Scott Fugger. We're talking all about Matt Fraction and David Aja's run on Hawkeye. There are a couple other artists here and there in the run, but for the most part, it is those two creators along with Matt Hollinsworth, and we will be discussing all sorts of various aspects of this. But first, Scott, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How about you?
Doing pretty well. We're just going to dive right in here. And I think for me, this is one of my favorite of the more recent comics, because this comic was in progress when I first signed up for Marvel Unlimited. I think it was towards the end of its run, because I want to say 2015 was the year I picked up Marvel Unlimited and just started making my way through a bunch of things. But this was a comic that came highly recommended from multiple people, and I think it's just because it's such a unique take on the character. It's like when you think of Hawkeye, especially with the MCU being 10 years in now, you probably think of that version of Hawkeye before you would think of this one that we see in this particular run.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, I'm actually not super. I haven't stayed very current on the Marvel movies. So for me, this is actually the first Hawkeye comic that I read. I think when I started Marvel Unlimited, I asked you for some recommendations, and this was one of the ones that you said, and I loved it enough that I picked up. They have the whole thing in like two slightly oversized hardcover editions. So I just read through those over the last couple days again to refresh myself, and really enjoyed it the second time around too.
Yeah, I kind of blew through it yesterday on Marvel Unlimited. I was just like sitting on the couch and I was like, okay, yes, I remember all of this. And we'll talk about certain issues that stand out and everything like that. But, with it's been a thing about the pronunciation of his last name. And I know you have a little sidebar on that before we move forward, because technically, I guess his first name is not David, but that's how it's spelled and pronounced here. So that's what I always say. So I guess, everyone just pronounces his name wrong.
Yeah, I think last time, or when we did like the Marvel Unlimited episode, we probably ran into the similar thing. So I wanted to be definitive this time, and so it's definitely Aha.
Yeah, and when he's in Spain, his first name is David instead of David, which makes sense because they pronounce things differently there, and different letters have different pronunciations. But, we'll link to a fun little article on that. And one of the things I want to start with for this run is just talking about the various relationships that Clint has. And the two big ones are his relationship with Kate Bishop and his relationship with his dog Lucky. So why don't we start with Lucky? Because I feel like this one's going to go by a little faster just because Lucky is a dog. So, it's sort of this thing where Clint gets into trouble and the dog tries to help and winds up being severely injured and, has to go through strenuous surgery and recovery and everything like that. So the dog ends up with one eye, but he's still a perfectly fine dog to have in your apartment and everything like that. And I just really like that they gave this story that added element there, because there are certain Marvel characters that are tied to like an animal sidekick, like when you see Lockjaw or something like that. But for this, it wasn't necessarily that Lucky was his sidekick, so to speak. He was his pet that he just came across and ended up keeping because no one else was really paying attention to this dog or feeding this dog. And ironically, the dog's name was initially Arrow, so of course he had to change that.
Yeah, I really loved how it was Arrow originally, and he was like, "Well, we'll find you something better." Didn't really want him encroaching on his territory, I guess. But like Lucky was actually introduced in right in issue one, and I thought something that like stood out to me, and that was kind of, in the first scene of issue one is Clint falling out of a building and then waking up in the hospital, and the doctor's going over like all the injuries that he had. And then, like later on in the issue, when he brings Lucky into the vet, it like really mirrors that first scene with the vet kind of saying, this is wrong with him, this is wrong with him. He's not a good candidate for surgery, but I thought it was really cool how they kind of introduced both the characters in a similar way.
Yeah, and what's interesting with his relationship with the dog too is that he sort of pays more attention to the dog than he does most people. And I think, with animal lovers, it might be that way for a lot of them, where it's like, they focus their attention on the animals. And with Clint, it's just something different for him because, as you see throughout the run, he sort of is always letting people down. And there's nothing that he really does to try and change that. He just keeps pushing people away. But with the dog, the dog is there to stay no matter what happens to either Clint or the dog. It's like the dog is sort of one of the few priorities in his life.
That's until he, jumps ship and goes to the West Coast with Kate, though.
Yeah, true. But you do see that Clint is fairly upset about it. He's like, oh, she took the dog. Like, seriously?
Yeah. It was definitely a little bit of a blow, but, a happy reunion in the end.
Yeah, that actually kind of leads us into the relationship between Clint and Kate. And it's never something that is, like super romantic or anything like that. It's obvious that he's sort of taking on this mentor role, even though he might not be the best pick for a mentor. But it's like, okay, who else is going to show you how to shoot a bow and arrow and, do all these crazy things with them? But as far as how he acts, it's like, okay, here's what not to do, pretty much. And I think that sort of strengthens their relationship throughout the run because you see that Kate is always coming back no matter how mean Clint can be or anything like that. And then you see her take the dog and it's like, okay, she's not putting up with Clint, but in a way she's always going to stick around and be there for him. But she does this one thing that she kind of knows will probably get under his skin a little. And then I think it's sort of just to teach him a lesson a bit too.
Yeah, I think so too. Like I think a little bit before she left, she kind of gave like this big speech to him, saying, no matter basically the stuff you just said, like no matter how shitty you are, like I'll still be around, whatever, like we'll be here for each other, help each other out all the time. And then she looks over, she grabs his hand and then looks over and he's asleep, which I thought was really funny. But yeah, I mean, even like when she's out in LA, she's still like there's one scene where she pulls out like the USB arrow and then like flashes back to him giving it to her and like basically saying how useless it is, but then it comes in handy in the end. So and then another thing, in the editions that I have, it actually includes I think it's one of the Avengers, it's the Young Avengers, an issue from there that kind of goes into it's like a flashback to when, I guess, after Civil War, Hawkeye became Ronin or during Civil War. I'm kind of confused about the timeline a little bit.
Okay, I definitely did
I guess
not
it's
read
after
that
because
one.
Captain America is dead, so it must be after Civil War.
Okay.
But it's when Kate took up Hawkeye, the name Hawkeye,
Right.
and it's like Hawkeye confronting her as Ronin. He like tests her, and then he brings her back to the Avengers headquarters and tries to teach her a lesson by he like does the thing where you shoot an arrow and then you shoot an arrow into the arrow after she says it's impossible, and like he bets her, if I can make this shot, then you got to give me the name Hawkeye back. You got to give me my bow back. And then he makes it, of course. And she leaves, but then later that night, when the Avengers are out on a mission, she sneaks back in and steals it back. And then once he sees that, he's basically like, you got spunk, kid, like keep the bow and we'll both use the Hawkeye name. So I mean, that was good supplemental material, like not quite as like an origin story, but kind of bring back to how their relationship started.
Yeah, and that's interesting because there was also a moment in this run where that same shot is made, and I believe it's Kate who makes it. You see the arrow split the other arrow, and it's sort of just this look at the target in that one panel. So that's kind of a nice nod to that, then, that I didn't even fully catch. Because when you're reading these things on Marvel Unlimited, you're not getting the same order necessarily unless you go look up the specific trades that were released to see if there were any additional issues from other series put in. Like you said, that one was Young Avengers or something like that, so it was not something that would be in the Hawkeye section in Marvel Unlimited. So, I guess that's another sort of con to binge reading in Marvel Unlimited. You don't always get the full order of everything, but that's on me because I could have looked that up. But I just think that the relationship between these two, even as the run goes, you can see it changing constantly. You see when they are in the limo going to this big fancy party and everything, Kate kind of puts her hand on top of Clint's and she turns and he's asleep. So she's trying to have this moment and he's just talking about sandwiches in his sleep. And it's just one of those things where it's like, okay, typical Clint. And here's Kate trying to just, let him know that she's there for him no matter what. And it still wasn't like this super romantic moment. It was more of like this endearing, almost father-daughter relationship at times. And, even Clint's like, he makes a comment early on in the run, because I don't want to sleep with you, sort of thing.
Yeah, I think it was a good thing that they included that because then it really does kind of frame the way you look at their relationship going forward.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like this is such a character-based series that I think it's a really good idea to like establish early on like how each character kind of sees each other initially, so the relationships can continue to develop, and that's like another exciting part of reading the story.
Yeah, the next thing I sort of want to dive into that sort of spins off of this is their portrayal of Clint throughout this run, because this is something we haven't really seen before. And honestly, I think this is the only straight up solo Hawkeye series that I have read. I honestly don't even know if there are others, to be honest. I'm sure there was after this, but as far as before this and with the history of the character, I only know Hawkeye from watching the MCU movies and reading maybe some of the older Avengers comics where he's in those, but it's as a team, so it's not a solo story. And I think they just made him really likable in this, even though at times he isn't, because he does push people away, and you see him getting a divorce from Bobby, and you see how he had treated Jessica Drew. You even have Natasha appear in this, and they call her the work wife, which is very in line with what we know between the relationship that those two have in the movies as well. So I did like that they sort of kept Natasha and Clint as that same friendship role that they already established in the movies and everything. But it's just one of those things where, yes, he's an Avenger, but Avengers can also be sort of down on their luck and have these real world problems to deal with that aren't, aliens coming out of a portal or anything like that. So I think they did a really good job with grounding this character, so to speak.
Yeah, I think it's really kind of rooted in reality, and like you said, like down in your luck, he's kind of like an average guy, just trying to get by, living his life, kind of trying to do like the right thing, and like outside of the context of good and evil, like strictly like major like good and evil, like all the you know like I'm reading through Ultimate Spider-Man still, and I'm about to get to Secret Wars, and I'm like, I don't even know what I'm gonna do with that mess, how much of it I'm gonna read and stuff. So like I think having it rooted more in everyday life. In the trade I have, it says like the synopsis right in the like first page is like, this is what an Avenger does when he's not being an Avenger. I was like, that's like really refreshing and something that we don't really see in most of the comics very often.
Yeah, exactly. And just the fact that they have him going up against these quote unquote villains that are really just everyday people for the most part. you have the landlord who is just part of this Russian crew, basically, and they own, I believe they said it was like every building for 3 or 6 blocks or something like that. And, Clint gets into it with them and buys the building, and then they want it back. And that's a lot of what this story revolves around as far as who Clint is fighting against. But then you also have Madame Mask, and she's sort of this rich girl who inherited her dad's money and everything like that, and she wears this sort of gold flamboyant mask around, and she's probably more of a villain, so to speak, than the Russian guys are, but you constantly see those characters throughout this run, and it's like, okay, the story kind of grows with it too as they start to bring in other people to take care of Clint and even Kate at one point. So you just have this really great story that is so focused on what is going on with Clint's life outside of being an Avenger. None of this has anything to do with the Avengers at all, and I think that's what makes it nice, because then you can have those appearances from Natasha and Bobby and Jessica Drew, and it doesn't have to be like, okay, hey Clint, we need you to go do this for the Avengers and blah blah blah. It's just like they pop in, they leave, and then it's not like it's making Clint go focus on these other things necessarily. Sure, he has some divorce papers to sign, but that's not taking him away from fixing his current problem.
Yeah, I was actually reading like a few articles about this because it was kind of like a sleeper hit that people weren't expecting, and like one of the things that they, were kind of like focusing on was the fact that at least for the first half of the run, especially, like the stories are really, it's like you read one issue and it makes sense. You don't have to worry about everything else going on, like you were saying, and also, the fact that it's like, or yeah, just the fact that it's really kind of insular to both the series and the individual issues kind of allows anyone to pick it up, whether you're a big fan of everything Marvel or whether it's like, I mean, it would be a great first comic even. And I think you mentioned like the Russian guys, their overuse of the word bro,
Yeah.
I think is kind of something that really it's like something super unique to this and something that like you can imagine that in your head, and like just the fact that like kind of happens so often throughout the series, it's like it's kind of part of like the definition of the series. Like there's just on like like I said, going through like articles and stuff, like there's so many little jokes that are inside jokes, but to anyone who even read like one issue, they like would totally make sense, saying like, bro, come on bro, like I don't know, I just think it was really cool how they kind of used that to like help create the identity of the comic.
Definitely. And one of the other things I want us to touch on here is the fact that, you have Kate and Clint together for basically the first half of this run. And then we see her leave with Lucky. So we have these two stories going on. And it's a little hard to tell if they're happening simultaneously or not, because obviously Kate had to make her way from Brooklyn to the West Coast, and it seems like she drove. So I would imagine that Clint's story just continues for those days that she's driving out there. And, she meets this couple and wants to sort of try out being a PI while she's out there, and things don't quite go as she had planned. So then you have these two stories going on, and it does get a little confusing at times, just because you're like, okay, are these all happening at the same time, or are there a few days in between because of that drive time? It's not really clear, but at the same time, I'm not entirely sure it needs to be. I think the more important thing is that Kate is going off on her own and trying to figure things out away from Clint to see, possibly if her problem is the fact that she keeps sticking around with Clint, or if, she really does want to do this on her own instead now, or that sort of thing. So I thought that was an interesting way to have her do that.
Yeah, I really like especially Kate's storyline with Madame Mask when she's out in California. Um, it's weird. Another thing about the editions I have is like the back half of it, a lot of them are like out of order, and like I'm trying to, like, they were purposely put in that order, of course, but like it didn't really make sense to me the way they had them, and I can't really imagine the way that they were originally published either. So like the timelines between the two sides of things get kind of confusing, but yeah, I think when they all like when both sides come back together for like the last couple issues, it's kind of a really good payoff, after them being apart for so long. It really it feels like a good conclusion to the story.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to talk about some of the standout issues from this run because every run is going to have its highs and lows. And I feel like with this only being 22 issues, as far as the Hawkeye series itself goes, not any other issues that they include in the trades or anything, but with these 22 issues, I think there was only one where I was like, okay, I guess there was a point to this, and that was the kids cartoon
Yeah,
issue.
that one's
And
really weird.
yeah, it's like they wanted to give Clint a break, so they kind of just bookended the comic with him. So he was there at the beginning, turning on the show for them, and then we see the kids watching the show, and it's mostly a bunch of superhero dogs, I guess, so to speak. So maybe it's some sort of metaphor for Clint's life, where a bunch of the dogs have powers, and then there's this one that doesn't, and that's supposed to be Hawkeye. I guess you could look at it that way, and maybe that's exactly what they were intending. I don't know. But then you see at the very end, the mom wakes up and gets ready to leave, and she sees Clint is fast asleep, and the kids are, told to be quiet. So they be quiet, and then they leave, and Lucky just curls up with Clint on the couch.
Yeah, I wonder if that one was to kind of, if they were maybe in like a time crunch for a couple issues, like art wise or something, because there's definitely a very different like art direction too. I'm not sure if there was a different artist on that issue or anything, but it also seemed kind of weird that it was referencing an issue that was like at that point would have been almost a year ago, because it was supposed to happen during I think issue like 11, and that was like issue 17. So I guess like half a year ago, but and that the issue that they were referencing, where Clint like saves the building on Christmas, that's another one that I kind of was a little bit confused by, because it's like at the start of the issue he had just saved the building, and then at the like throughout the issue it kind of flashes back to why he needed to, but it never really addressed how he did, I think.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure on that. And, like we said, some things get a little muddled with the order and everything like that, because I do remember the kids were like, oh, we want to watch the show. And then it's like several issues later, they're finally watching the show.
Yeah, so that was a little weird, but I don't know, one of my I think my personal favorite of the issues was the two-parter actually, the tape, um, which is where there's a leaked video of Hawkeye murdering a terrorist, that Shield said was a Navy SEAL or whatever, and so he has to go and uh, bid on this auction to get the only copy of the tape, and then that's where Kate originally runs into Madame Mask, and she, you know, knocks her out, dresses up as her, and then you know stops Hawkeye from bidding so she can bid, which seemed kind of. I guess it kind of makes sense the way it was like, story wise, it's like you think that stuff's gone wrong, but then in the end, it turns out right, which I thought was cool about that. And actually, I read an interview today with Matt Fraction where I guess originally when he pitched the series, it was kind of supposed to be like those two episodes were kind of like a more like a James Bondy type feel to it, and then he ended up having to retool it and come back. But I thought those two really stood out and was a good cohesive story that kind of also set up a lot of the rest of the series.
Yeah, and we do have a few times that the artist switches up. I believe it was that tape issue number 4, and you have a different artist there. You have Francavilla on a couple of issues, and then you also have Annie Wu on some of the later issues. She is more so when she comes in when Kate goes on her trip, pretty much. So she does a handful of issues while Kate is out in LA and everything like that, or wherever it is in California. I'm just guessing LA. But it's one of those things where sometimes you notice the difference in the art, but I think when Annie Wu came in and took over, I didn't notice a huge difference. And I think a lot of that has to do with Matt Hollingsworth and the coloring work that he did, because I definitely want to touch on that, since it's a much different feel than what you normally get when you're just sort of not doing as different of a story as you are with this one. Like if you are reading the Avengers or Captain America or Spider-Man, for the most part, the art and the coloring on those books will look very similar unless they're doing something different with the story. And I think with this, it gave them a little more leeway to have this book look different than a bunch of the main staple titles, I guess.
Yeah, I really love the coloring, and I think it works really well with it's kind of like minimalist artwork. It's not like super 3D in your face like a lot of the kind of like early to mid 2000s stuff was.
Right.
It's kind of the artwork in itself is kind of muted and flat, and then the color palette is like, kind of it'll be like two or three kind of different palettes throughout the issues, but within the pages it'll like really stick to one. And I think it makes it really cohesive. It makes it like really unique, and it really is something that kind of like stands out to me as something that I enjoy about this run, in addition to the story.
Yeah, and I personally really enjoy Francavilla's work. Hopefully I'm saying his last name properly. I'm using the Spanish version of those double L's there. But it's one of those things, he's an artist I follow on Instagram, and he sort of has this noir feeling and old school sort of horror poster vibe to his work. So I think in certain instances that works well for this. And I believe the 2 issues he was on might have been sort of the more standalone issues as well.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I'm not quite sure, but yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to keep things straight, especially when you sort of breeze through them like you and I did to catch up for this. But I know we each have an issue that we really want to talk about here too. So we're going to backtrack a little bit and talk about these 2 standout issues. And for me, issue 11 is the one where the story is told from Lucky's perspective. And I just found that to be so creative and so different because, we've been seeing the dog since the first issue. And now we get to see things from his perspective. And you can see that most of the words are sort of just jumbled and scribbles. And then you see certain words pop up. And, it's scenes that we've already had a chance to read through. So now we're just seeing it from Lucky's perspective. So there's some, like slightly different angles and stuff like that. And you see him going up to the roof, and he gets into a little more trouble on his own. And he actually knows about the dead body up on the roof before Clint does. So I thought that was interesting to be like, okay, the dog knows this, but he doesn't really have a way of telling his owner that, hey, there's a dead person on the roof.
Yeah, I thought that I really liked that issue too. It kind of like we were mentioning at the start how him and Clint are one of like the main relationships. So putting us in his shoes was a really cool, like you said, way to kind of get a new perspective on the events that we already saw and kind of fill in some of the blanks too. And then the other issue that stood out to me in that way was in issue 19, after Clint, I think he gets shot, or at least he's close to getting shot, and he ends up going deaf, which, it's kind of a similar creative storytelling, where they have Aha has like a really cool. It's almost like a manual type like feel to some of his work, and so like when he shows like people using sign language, it does it in like figure one, figure two, figure three, figure four, and I thought that really was cool, and then also just the way that you're kind of experiencing it the way Clint is as a deaf person, kind of either not quite hearing, not quite being able to read everyone's lips, or not quite, you know, if he's like he flashed back to when he was a kid and he also had like temporary deafness, so he did know sign language and he was able to read lips a bit, but kind of you having to fill in the blanks when you don't fully understand what someone's saying. I thought that was a really cool way to bring something kind of fresh to the way they were telling the story.
Yeah, and even if you don't understand sign language, it was still sort of easy to go along with the story and follow along because you had this general idea of everything that happened beforehand and how Clint handles things by the time you get to issue 19. So it's like, okay, Clint is going to react in typical Clint fashion, and you even see, Barney saying that in the comic and everything like that. So that is definitely a very interesting issue too, and I really do just think everyone should go read this Hawkeye run because I think it might change a lot of people's minds about how they feel about the character, because I feel like in the movies he's sort of like not necessarily the least liked, but it just feels like he's kind of the least important team member, I guess you could say, or something like that. But also, real quick here, I do want to note that Francavilla is actually Italian, not Spanish. My apologies. The languages are very similar, though, as far as pronunciations go, from what I know. So hopefully I'm still saying that correctly, but who knows, because I feel like I say this every time I talk about comics. I'm like, I don't know if I'm pronouncing these names right. My apologies.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree that pretty much like everyone should read it. I think I've read like one or two other kind of like maybe 4 to 5 like quick Hawkeye series that they had, and they didn't quite hit home the same way. Obviously he's a superhero, so a lot of the stuff is more superhero-y, but I just feel like this is such a good like characterization of him and gives like such a unique take on kind of any sort of character in the Marvel universe, that it stands out so well on its own, and yeah, I think it's really great, and lots of the best comic lists included as well, so that's just another thing for it going for it.
Yeah, and just one last thing that I want to note here is that Fraction's story really meshed well with the art style that we got from all of the artists in this run. So it really just came full circle for me. It was sort of like, okay, you have Hawkeye here and he's in this state of mind to start the comic, and that doesn't really change by the end of it necessarily, but it's just like he's sort of gone through this entire cycle of bad things happening, and here he is again, and it's like you can almost picture them just doing not the exact same thing over again, but having Clint sort of just go through this again in a different way.
For sure, yeah, I mean, and I think that's kind of another reason that's good, that it's like a short and sweet series. Like 22 issues was like a really good run for it, I think. Because like you said, it's like you get to know who he is better, but there's not really like kind of like a full sort of growth. So it's like it's just like a really good kind of like establishing shot of like here's this character, and it kind of leaves it open for the future too, which is always nice, but I think it's like a really good kind of like solid foundation to get a hang of, you know, who they want you to see Clint Barton as, and you get like a really fully rounded image of it.
Yeah, and this run is equally as important for Kate Bishop because we see her get her own Hawkeye series after this. And I had started reading that, and from what I read, I did enjoy it. I have to go back and see how much of that is on Marvel Unlimited now, but it's one of those things where, yes, this story was largely about Clint and his life, but Kate still held a certain amount of importance in all of the issues too. So it was sort of more like a joint effort with these two characters as Hawkeye, since they both go by the name.
For sure. Yeah, I've been meaning to go back and check some of the Kate Bishop solo stuff out. I'd probably add those to my reading list now.
Yeah, I feel like with Marvel Unlimited, it's a never ending reading list. I'm still making my way through all of the old Amazing Spider Man issues. I'm actually going in like chronological order for the history of Spider Man. So every now and then I'm like dipping into Daredevil or X Men or wherever he goes in other series as well. So it is a very lengthy process, but it is chugging along. I should probably pick back up with that soon, but there's going to be an onslaught of San Diego Comic-Con news coming this week. It'll be over by the time you all hear this, but it is going to be a lot to keep up with.
I'm sure. And I've seen those spreadsheets for Amazing Spider-Man reading order, so that's definitely a huge endeavor.
Yeah, Marvel was putting together posts, and I think they ended up just breaking them down by year. So it's been a post for every year since 1963, pretty much. So it's a lot.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Awesome. Well, Scott, thank you so much for coming on to talk about this. This is probably one of my favorite comic book runs that I have read. And with so many comics out there, it's kind of hard to say that, but I also feel very comfortable saying that. I don't know if it would be, top 3 necessarily, but it's pretty high up there, maybe top 10 at least.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if I made room for it on my bookshelf, I definitely think highly of it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'm sure we'll have you back on to talk about some other comics here soon, or movies or books or what have you. Anything you want, we can talk about. But for now, we're going to wrap this up. And to our listeners, as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.